He had already accepted that his best years were behind him. At 60, the mountains no longer called his name, the radio stayed silent, and the cabin echoed with a loneliness he never learned how to outrun. His body was weaker now, his heart unreliable, his hands no longer as steady as they once were. The world had quietly moved on, and no one seemed to need him anymore. Then one winter morning, through falling snow and bitter cold, he noticed something that did not belong. Large paw prints, uneven, struggling. Moments later, an aging German shepherd stood at the edge of his porch, injured, exhausted, and alone. The dog did not bark, did not beg. He simply waited as if he knew this man would understand. What neither of them realized was that meeting was not an accident. It was the moment two forgotten lives were about to remind each other, and perhaps all of us, that even when strength fades, purpose can return in the quietest, most unexpected ways. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, because some stories don't just entertain, they change the way we see loyalty loss and the quiet miracles hiding in plain sight. Snow drifted steadily from a pale winter sky, thick flakes spiraling through the frozen air as daylight thinned and the mountains of northern Montana withdrew into shadow. Arthur Collins had learned long ago to read weather the way other men read faces. At 60, his eyes still tracked the wind, instinctively noting how it bent the snow sideways, how it whispered through the blackened pine needles surrounding the cabin. Winter was settling in for another long occupation, and Arthur felt it in his bones long before the cold reached his skin. The cabin stood alone near the forest's edge, a modest structure of darkened logs and a sagging porch roof weighed down by years of snowfall. Arthur had chosen this place deliberately after retirement, far enough from town that no one dropped by unannounced, close enough to the mountains that he could pretend, at least for a while, that nothing fundamental had changed. Inside, the space was sparse but meticulously kept. A cast-iron stove occupied the center of the room, its dull glow the only warmth against the encroaching cold. A single wooden table held a chipped mug, a folded map no longer used, and a weathered notebook filled with handwriting that grew shakier toward the later pages. Arthur Collins was a tall man, once broad-shouldered and solid-built, for hauling ropes and lifting bodies out of ravines. Time had compressed him slightly, stooping his posture by degrees, but his frame remained imposing. His face was angular, marked by deep lines, carved through years of exposure to sun, wind, and sleepless nights. A graying beard clung stubbornly to his jaw, trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity. His hair, once dark brown, had thinned and turned the color of old ash, cut close to his scalp in the same practical style he had worn for decades. His eyes, steel blue and observant, still carried the intensity of a man used to scanning terrain for signs of life, though now they often lingered too long on nothing at all. Arthur had spent 32 years in mountain search and rescue. He had been the man called when hikers vanished, when plains clipped ridgelines, when storms swallowed hunters whole. His reputation was built on steadiness under pressure. He did not panic. He did not hesitate. People trusted him because he spoke little and acted decisively. That trust had shaped him, given his life a clear outline. Every mission, no matter how grim, carried purpose. Retirement had arrived not with ceremony, but with a quiet meeting in a fluorescent-lit office. His knees were no longer reliable. His heart doctor said gently, needed fewer extremes. The words had sounded reasonable, even kind, but Arthur had walked out knowing something irreplaceable had been taken from him. He shook hands, accepted a plaque he never hung, and drove north, until the roads narrowed and cell service vanished. Now silence followed him everywhere. It pressed in during the long afternoons and settled heavily at night. No radios crackled. No alarms pierced the dark. The absence of sound was not peaceful, it was accusatory. Arthur found himself listening for noises that would never come, his body bracing for urgency his life no longer required. Each movement reminded him of what he had lost. His right knee protested sharply when he stood, a dry clicking sound echoing too loudly in the small cabin. His left shoulder stiffened in the cold, an old injury from hauling a stretcher down an icy slope years ago. He had saved the man, lost a portion of himself, and accepted it without complaint at the time. Sacrifice made sense when it served something larger. What unsettled Arthur most was not pain but irrelevance. Death did not frighten him. He had brushed too close to it too often. What terrified him was the slow erosion of usefulness, the idea of being alive yet unnecessary. In town, younger men now wore the gear he once maintained, spoke into radios he once carried. They were competent, strong, eager. Arthur did not resent them. That almost made it worse. As dusk deepened, Arthur stepped onto the porch, pulling his heavy wool coat tighter around his frame. The cold bit immediately sharp and intimate. Snow had begun to accumulate along the railing, softening its edges. He scanned the tree line out of reflex, noting the way shadows pooled between trunks. His breath clouded in front of him, rhythmic, measured, still controlled. He told himself he liked this life. The isolation, the predictability. Yet some evenings like this one, the quiet pressed too hard. He found himself remembering faces, people pulled back from the edge, and others he could not save. He remembered names, then forgot them again, which felt like another kind of failure. Arthur turned back inside, unaware that this was the last evening he would spend truly alone. The wind shifted as night fully claimed the mountains, carrying with it the faintest sound, a disturbance against the snow almost imperceptible. Arthur did not hear it yet. He was too busy pouring hot water over instant coffee grounds, his hands steady despite their age, his thoughts circling familiar hollow paths. Outside, the snowfall thickened, blanketing the world in white as something unseen moved slowly toward the light of the cabin. Arthur Collins noticed the tracks before he noticed anything else. They cut unevenly across the fresh snow just beyond the cabin's porch, large paw prints pressed too deeply on one side as if weight had shifted awkwardly with each step. The pattern disturbed him not with fear, but with recognition. Years of search and rescue work had trained his eyes to read imbalance, injury, exhaustion. These were not the confident strides of a healthy animal moving with purpose. These were the marks of something tired, something pushing forward despite pain. The afternoon light was already fading, the sky bruised with gray and steel-blue clouds that promised a heavier snowfall by nightfall. Arthur stood still, his breath slow, his posture instinctively alert. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not panic but awareness. It surprised him how quickly his body remembered what his mind had been trying to forget. The tracks ended at the edge of the porch. For a moment, Arthur thought the animal might have moved on, frightened by the scent of a human. Then he heard it, a low, strained exhale, almost lost beneath the whisper of falling snow. The dog stood several feet from the steps, partially obscured by the drifting flakes. A German shepherd, old, big, once powerful shoulders now sloping with age. Its coat, once likely a rich black and tan, had dulled into muted shades, gray threading through the darker fur along its muzzle and spine. One ear drooped slightly, no longer holding the sharp, upright attention typical of the breed. The dog's eyes were dark and intelligent, but clouded with fatigue. Its right hind leg dragged just enough to be noticeable, the paw barely lifting from the snow. Each breath came heavy, visible in the cold air. Yet the dog did not whine or whimper. It simply stood there steady despite the tremor running through its frame, watching Arthur with a gaze that was neither aggressive nor fearful, only expectant. Arthur's heart tightened in a way that felt uncomfortably familiar. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath, not as a prayer, but as an acknowledgement. The dog did not move closer. It did not retreat. It waited. Arthur took a cautious step forward, boots crunching softly against the snow. The dog's head lifted a fraction, ears twitching, but it remained in place. Years ago, Arthur would have noted the discipline immediately. This was not a stray acting on impulse. This was an animal trained to assess, to hold position, to read human movement. As Arthur drew nearer, he noticed the metal tag hanging from the dog's collar, dulled and scratched by time. He crouched slowly, ignoring the protest in his knees, and squinted to read it. Bruno. The letters were worn but legible. Beneath the name there had once been additional information. Unit number, contact details, but those markings had faded into illegibility. Whoever had owned Bruno before had not expected the collar to last this long. Arthur swallowed. "Bruno," he said quietly, testing the name in the cold air. The dog's tail gave the faintest twitch, not a wag, just a sign of recognition, of understanding. Arthur straightened with effort, his lower back flaring with pain. He felt suddenly self-conscious, aware of how slow he must look, how unsteady. The dog watched him without judgment. There was no pity in Bruno's eyes, only patience. That patience unsettled Arthur more than aggression ever could. Bruno took one step forward, then another, the injured leg lagging behind. Arthur noticed dried blood matted into the fur along the joint, dark against the snow. Not fresh, days old, maybe longer. The dog had been surviving like this for a while. "You're a long way from anywhere," Arthur murmured, scanning the tree line behind Bruno. No human tracks followed the dog's path. No tire marks on the narrow access road. Whoever had last been responsible for Bruno was gone. The wind picked up, pushing snow harder against Arthur's face. Dusk was surrendering to night quickly now, the mountains swallowing the last scraps of light. Arthur knew the temperature would drop sharply within the hour. He looked back at the cabin, its single window glowing faintly from the stove inside. He hesitated. Taking responsibility had once been his entire life. Now it felt like a door he had closed deliberately, fearing that opening it again would only remind him of everything he could no longer do. He was not equipped for this. His body was unreliable. His heart condition alone made exertion dangerous. Taking in a large injured dog was not sensible. Bruno shifted his weight, the motion careful, controlled. He did not collapse. He did not beg. He simply remained. Arthur exhaled slowly. He saw himself in the dog, two aging bodies bearing the invisible scars of work done well and long, now cast aside by systems that valued youth and efficiency. Bruno had not stopped being what he was trained to be. The world had simply stopped asking. "All right," Arthur said at last, the words carrying more surrender than decision. "All right." He stepped aside and gestured toward the porch. Bruno limped forward, each movement deliberate, dignified, despite the pain. When the dog reached the threshold, he paused, glancing back once at the darkening forest, then crossed into the shelter of the cabin without being prompted. Inside, the warmth hit immediately. Bruno lowered himself carefully onto the wooden floor, releasing a quiet huff, as if only now allowing himself to rest. Arthur closed the door against the wind, the finality of the sound echoing through the small space. The cabin felt different with another presence in it. Smaller, fuller. Arthur removed his coat and knelt beside the dog with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this kind of thing 100 times before. He examined the injured leg gently, fingers probing with care. The swelling was significant, the joint stiff. Age had not been kind to Bruno either. "You're not young anymore, are you?" Arthur said softly. Bruno's eyes remained on him, unblinking, trusting. Arthur cleaned the wound as best he could, his hands steady despite the ache in his wrists. He wrapped the leg carefully, murmuring reassurances he had once offered to lost hikers and frightened survivors. The words came back easily, too easily. When he finished, Arthur sat back against the wall chest, rising and falling more quickly than he liked. His heart fluttered, then settled. Bruno shifted closer, resting his head near Arthur's boot, the warmth of his body seeping through the leather. The realization hit Arthur quietly but forcefully. Neither of them had anywhere else to go. Outside, snow piled against the cabin walls, sealing them off from the world beyond. Inside, two retired servants of duty shared the same silence, not empty this time, but weighted with understanding. Arthur stared into the firelight, his thoughts slower now, heavier. He had not planned for this. He had not wanted it. Yet as Bruno's steady breathing filled the room, Arthur felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the layers of resignation he had built around himself. Not hope, not yet, but recognition. Night fell hard and fast, the kind of mountain darkness that did not creep, but dropped all at once, swallowing edges and distances. The temperature plunged with it, cold, tightening around the cabin like a clenched fist. Snow struck the walls in steady, relentless taps, as if the storm itself were testing how long the small structure and the man inside could endure. Arthur Collins moved slowly across the cabin floor, every step measured. The fire crackled in the cast-iron stove, its orange light throwing long shadows that stretched and bent across the walls. Bruno lay near the hearth, his large body curled awkwardly, favoring his injured leg. The dog's chest rose and fell in heavy, deliberate breaths. He did not sleep deeply. His ears twitched now and then, instincts refusing to fully stand down, even in warmth. Arthur lowered himself onto a wooden chair with a controlled exhale that bordered on a grunt. The chair creaked under his weight. He pressed a hand briefly against his lower back, fingers splayed, waiting for the sharpest pain to pass. The motion was automatic, practiced. Pain management had become a silent routine, one he rarely acknowledged out loud. "You and me," Arthur murmured, looking down at Bruno. "We're about the same age in dog years, I suppose." Bruno opened one eye, dark and steady, and watched him without moving his head. Arthur reached for the medical kit he kept tucked beneath the sink, an old red canvas bag, faded and frayed at the corners. It had followed him through more missions than he could count. He hadn't thrown it away after retirement because some part of him still believed preparation mattered. That belief had kept him alive for decades. It was not so easily unlearned. He knelt beside Bruno, again slower this time. His knees protested immediately, joints grinding softly, as if sand had been poured between them. Arthur paused, breathing through it, refusing to rush. He had learned patience the hard way, on ledges slick with ice in blizzards that erased landmarks beside people whose lives depended on steady hands. His hand shook now, just slightly, a fine tremor that came and went. Age, fatigue, the cold, he couldn't say which was to blame. He unwrapped the bandage he had placed earlier and examined the leg more closely. The swelling was stubborn, the joint stiff and uncooperative beneath his fingers. Bruno did not flinch. He endured the inspection with quiet acceptance, muscles tense but controlled. "Good boy," Arthur said softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. It startled him how natural it felt. As Arthur cleaned and rewrapped the wound, his mind drifted not backward into memory, but inward. The rhythm of the work awakened something he had tried to bury, the focus, the narrowing of the world to what lay directly in front of him. There was no room for doubt when hands were busy saving something. The ache in his chest tightened not from exertion, but from recognition. This feeling was what he had lost. The realization hit harder than he expected. It wasn't the physical work he missed most. It was the certainty, the knowledge that for a moment he mattered exactly as he was. Arthur finished securing the bandage and sat back on his heels. His heart began to race unexpectedly, pounding against his ribs with an urgency that had nothing to do with the task. He pressed a hand to his sternum, breathing carefully, counting under his breath until the rhythm steadied. Bruno shifted closer, resting his heavy head against Arthur's shin. The warmth of the dog's body seeped through denim and wool alike. Arthur froze. No animal had leaned on him like that in years. The weight was gentle but deliberate, as if Bruno understood precisely how much contact Arthur could bear. It was not affection born of need alone. It was trust. Arthur swallowed hard. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "Not really." Bruno exhaled a deep, calming sound and did not move. Arthur leaned back against the wall legs, stretched out awkwardly, letting the dog remain where he was. The firelight danced across Bruno's graying muzzle, highlighting the scars hidden beneath fur, old marks, faint but unmistakable to Arthur's trained eye. Training injuries, operational wear, the kind you earned over years of service, not accidents. "You worked hard," Arthur said, "longer than most." The dog's breathing slowed, settling into a steady rhythm. Outside, the storm intensified, snow piling against the door and windows. The cabin felt smaller now, but not empty. Arthur became acutely aware of every sound: Bruno's breathing, the pop of the fire, the wind screaming its way through the trees. Arthur shifted slightly, testing his back. Pain flared again, sharper this time, stealing his breath for a moment. He closed his eyes, jaw tightening. He had ignored his own body for so long that it now demanded payment with interest. That was the truth he rarely admitted. He had been broken long before retirement. Work had simply given his damage a reason. When Arthur opened his eyes, Bruno was watching him, not with concern in the human sense, but with attention, as if monitoring, assessing, the same way Arthur once watched victims for signs of shock. A dry laugh escaped Arthur's throat. "You see it too, don't you?" Bruno's tail thumped once against the floor, just once. Arthur felt something loosen inside his chest, something knotted and rigid for years. The laughter faded, replaced by a quiet ache. Two broken tools, he thought, still sharp in places, still dangerous if mishandled, still useful maybe in the right circumstances. He looked around the cabin, seeing it differently now. It was no longer just a retreat. It was shelter, a place where broken things might rest without being discarded. Arthur pushed himself carefully to his feet, bracing one hand against the wall. His movements were slow, deliberate, stripped of the confidence he once carried. He poured water into a bowl and set it near Bruno, followed by a portion of food from his own modest supplies. Bruno waited until Arthur nodded before eating, another small sign of discipline that tightened Arthur's throat unexpectedly. "You were trained well," Arthur said. "They don't teach that kind of patience anymore." As Bruno ate, Arthur sat back down, fatigue settling deep into his bones. He felt older than 60 in that moment. He felt every year of cold nights, every rescue that had ended too late, every decision that had cost him sleep. Yet beneath the exhaustion, something stubborn remained. Outside, the storm raged, indifferent to age or service or regret. Inside, two veterans shared the same warmth, each aware of their limits, each unwilling yet to surrender completely. Arthur stared into the fire until his eyes burned. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He did not know how long his body would hold or how long Bruno's leg would carry him. But for the first time since retirement, Arthur did not feel entirely finished. Not yet. Morning arrived quietly, filtered through a sky the color of old steel. Snow still fell lighter than the night before, but persistent, softening the world into muted whites and grays. Pale daylight slipped through the frost-clouded window of the cabin, touching the rough wooden floor and the edges of the stove like a hesitant visitor, unsure it was welcome. Arthur Collins woke stiff and disoriented, his body protesting the simple act of opening his eyes. His lower back burned with a deep, familiar ache, and his chest felt tight as though the cold had settled inside him during the night. For a long moment he lay still, listening. The storm had eased, but the forest remained restless. Branches creaked under the weight of snow, and wind sighed through the pines like a distant breath. Then Arthur heard it, a low sound barely audible at first, a restrained growl, not of threat but of alertness. Arthur turned his head slowly. Bruno was no longer curled near the stove. The German shepherd stood near the door. Weight shifted carefully off his injured leg. Head lifted, nose angled toward the wall as if the cabin itself were transparent. His ears, one still drooping, the other struggling to rise, trembled with concentration. The graying fur along his spine bristled subtly. Arthur pushed himself upright, wincing as pain flared along his spine. "What is it?" he asked softly, though some part of him already knew. Bruno did not look back. His attention was absolute, fixed on something beyond the cabin walls. He inhaled deeply, then again drawing in the cold air that slipped through the cracks around the doorframe. His tail stiffened body taut despite the visible strain in his hind leg. Arthur's pulse quickened not from fear but from recognition. He had seen this posture hundreds of times before on ridgelines, in ravines, in the aftermath of avalanches. The stance of an animal working, not reacting, searching. "Easy," Arthur murmured, though his own hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coat. He hesitated there, fingers curled around the worn fabric, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was not his job anymore. His badge was gone. His authority had ended quietly in an office far from these mountains. But the feeling inside his chest, the sharp, aching pull, was unmistakable. Arthur slipped into his boots with practiced care movements, slower than they used to be but still precise. He pulled on his coat, then paused, pressing a hand briefly to his sternum as his heart fluttered in warning. He closed his eyes, breathed through it, and opened them again. "I'm not chasing anything," he told himself, "just looking." Bruno turned his head, then dark eyes meeting Arthur's. There was no excitement in them, no urgency that bordered on recklessness, only intent. A shared understanding passed between them, quiet and heavy. Arthur opened the door. Cold air rushed in immediately, biting at his face, filling his lungs with sharp clarity. The snow outside was knee-deep, in places untouched except for a narrow disturbance cutting through the white, a set of footprints uneven and dragging, partially obscured by fresh snowfall. Human. Recent. Arthur's breath caught. Bruno stepped forward without waiting for permission, moving carefully but decisively, nose low to the ground. Arthur followed each step, deliberate, his knee, complaining loudly as he descended the porch steps. The world beyond the cabin felt immense, stripped of color and sound, reduced to essentials. They moved slowly into the forest. Bruno leading Arthur, trailing just far enough behind to observe. The dog paused frequently, recalibrating, scenting the air. Arthur recognized the pattern, the method beneath the age and injury. Bruno was compensating, working smarter, not harder. Arthur felt the old instincts stirring, uncomfortable and exhilarating all at once. He scanned the terrain automatically, noting slopes, potential hazards, the way the snow had drifted into deceptive hollows. His breathing grew labored, but he kept pace, resting briefly when Bruno paused. The trail led downward into a narrow ravine where the trees thinned and rock cut sharply through the snow. The wind funneled through the space, colder here, more aggressive. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs as they descended, his body protesting every step. He reminded himself to go slow, to listen to pain instead of fighting it. They found him near the bottom. The young man lay slumped against a rock, outcropping his body, folded awkwardly, one arm pinned beneath him. He couldn't have been more than 25. His face was pale, lips tinged blue, dark hair plastered to his forehead with melted snow. He wore a lightweight jacket, utterly insufficient for the conditions, and his gloves were missing. Arthur knelt with effort, ignoring the sharp stab in his back. He checked the man's breathing, shallow but present. A pulse fluttered weakly beneath his fingers. "Hey," Arthur said firmly, leaning close. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyelids fluttered. He groaned faintly but did not open his eyes. Hypothermia, exhaustion, disorientation. Arthur swallowed and glanced at Bruno, who stood watch, nearby, chest heaving, eyes alert. "Good work," Arthur said, voice rough. You did real good." Bruno's tail gave a slow, tired wag. Arthur removed his own gloves and wrapped them around the man's hands, then shrugged out of his coat, draping it carefully over the trembling body. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and unforgiving, but he welcomed it. Pain anchored him, kept him focused. He checked the man's legs, arms, no obvious fractures. Good. He pulled out his phone with numb fingers, relief flooding him when he saw a single bar of signal flicker weakly to life. He called it in voice, steady words, clipped and efficient, falling back into the cadence of command he had once worn like a second skin. As they waited, Arthur sat back against the rock chest, heaving. His heart raced again, faster this time, a warning he could not ignore. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing shallowly, grounding himself in the cold stone beneath his hand. Bruno moved closer, positioning himself between Arthur and the young man, body angled protectively, as if understanding that both needed guarding now. "Yeah," Arthur murmured, managing a faint smile despite the pain. "I know. Me too." The rescue team arrived nearly 40 minutes later, their bright jackets cutting through the white landscape like bursts of color. Arthur watched from the snow as they took over, efficient and strong, moving with the speed of youth. He felt no resentment, only an odd sense of completion. When it was done, when the stretcher disappeared up the ravine, Arthur's strength gave out. He sank heavily into the snow, breath-ragged, heart pounding violently. For a terrifying moment, the world narrowed to sound and sensation alone. Then it passed. Arthur lay back, staring up at the falling snow, laughter bubbling unexpectedly in his chest. It came out as a breathy chuckle, then something more. He hadn't laughed like that in years. Bruno stood over him, head cocked slightly, eyes curious. Arthur looked at the dog, snow collecting in his beard, and smiled fully for the first time in longer than he could remember. That evening, the snow fell more gently, as if the mountains themselves had decided to rest. The storm that had clawed at the cabin through the night and morning had softened into a quiet, persistent drift, each flake descending without urgency. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight and firelight, a small island of warmth surrounded by an indifferent white world. Arthur Collins sat at the wooden table, shoulders slightly hunched, his large frame seeming heavier than it had a day before. The rescue had taken more out of him than he had expected. His breath still felt shallow, as though his lungs were reluctant to draw the cold air too deeply. He placed a small orange pill onto his palm, studying it for a moment, before swallowing it with a careful sip of water. The medication tasted faintly bitter, a reminder that his heart now required negotiation rather than command. Bruno lay near the stove, his long body stretched out on the worn floorboards. The German shepherd's graying head rested against Arthur's boot, the weight solid and reassuring. His breathing was slow, and even the rise and fall of his chest steady, despite the stiffness in his injured leg. The firelight picked out the silver strands along his muzzle, and the faint scars hidden beneath his coat, traces of a working life that had demanded more than most would ever know. Arthur leaned back in his chair, one hand lowering instinctively to rest on Bruno's head. His fingers moved through the thick fur, slow and deliberate, as though each stroke were a conversation rather than a gesture. Bruno did not open his eyes, but his tail thumped once against the floor, a small acknowledgement. Outside, the forest stood hushed. The wind whispered softly through the pines, no longer howling, no longer angry. Arthur found himself listening not for danger or distress, but for absence, and discovering that the silence no longer felt accusatory. It felt shared. The events of the day replayed in his mind, not in sharp flashes, but in muted impressions. Bruno's sudden alertness, the uneven footprints in the snow, the young man's pale face, the sound of his own voice slipping effortlessly back into command when he made the call for help. Arthur had not realized how deeply he missed that version of himself until it surfaced again without warning. He had been careful not to romanticize it. His body had made its limits painfully clear. His heart had stuttered and raced. His back had screamed in protest, and his hands had trembled more than once. He had not led a rescue so much as participated in one, slowly, imperfectly, and with help. Yet it had mattered. Arthur stared into the fire, the flames reflected dimly in his steel blue eyes. For years he had measured his worth by function, by endurance, by how much he could carry, how long he could push, how little he needed in return. Retirement had stripped that framework away, leaving him with a version of himself he did not recognize or trust. Now, with Bruno's weight warm against his foot, Arthur began to understand something he had resisted for a long time. Usefulness was not a single fixed thing. Bruno stirred, lifting his head slightly and turning it toward Arthur. One ear twitched, still unable to rise fully, giving him a perpetually lopsided look that Arthur found unexpectedly endearing. The dog's eyes met his dark and steady, reflecting the firelight. "You're still working," Arthur said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. "Just differently." Bruno's gaze did not waver. He had never needed praise. He had only ever needed purpose. Arthur rose slowly from the chair, joints stiff, and moved to the small cabinet near the sink. Inside, tucked behind old canned food and a flashlight, was a folded blanket, thick woolen and frayed at the edges. He knelt with care and draped it gently over Bruno's body, mindful of the injured leg. The dog shifted slightly, then settled again, sighing softly. Arthur lowered himself onto the floor beside him, back against the wall. The movement cost him a sharp intake of breath, but he did not rush it. He had learned today that forcing his body no longer led to strength, only to consequences. He rested his hand on Bruno's shoulder, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fur, thinner than it once might have been, but still strong in its own way. For the first time since leaving the service, Arthur allowed himself to consider a future that did not revolve around proving something. He did not need to be the fastest, or the strongest, or the one who stayed standing longest. Perhaps it was enough to be present, to be attentive, to respond when called, even if the call came not from a radio, but from a quiet growl in the morning light. Bruno shifted closer, pressing his side against Arthur's leg, careful not to put weight on the injured limb. The gesture was simple, unremarkable, yet it struck Arthur with surprising force. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the warmth, the companionship, the unmistakable sense of being chosen. They were no longer heroes. Arthur accepted that now, without bitterness. Heroes belonged to stories that required spectacle. What remained here in this cabin was something quieter and more durable. Connection. Arthur exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "We'll take it slow," he said aloud. "You and me. No more pretending we're what we used to be." Bruno's tail moved once faintly in agreement. Outside, night deepened, but the cold no longer felt hostile. The cabin held firm against it, its walls thick with years of survival. Arthur thought of the young man, now safe of the team, that had arrived in time of the work continuing without him, and felt no jealousy. Only relief. He had not been replaced. He had been transformed. Arthur rested his head lightly against the wall, eyes half closed. His heart beat steadily now, no longer racing, no longer demanding his attention. He allowed himself a small smile, one that creased the deep lines in his weathered face. "Not useless," he murmured, "just older." Bruno's breathing remained steady, his presence a quiet anchor. The fire burned low, casting long, gentle shadows across the room, and for the first time in a long while, Arthur Collins did not feel alone. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or blinding light. They come softly on tired legs, through aching bones, in the shape of another soul who refuses to leave. Arthur did not ask God for a sign. Bruno did not ask to be saved. Yet somehow, in the silence of falling snow, grace found them both. Perhaps that is how God often works, not by restoring our youth, but by reminding us that we are still seen. Not by taking away our weakness, but by placing someone beside us who understands it. When strength fades, purpose does not disappear, it changes form. In everyday life, many of us feel like Arthur, older, slower, less needed than we once were. We wake up to quiet rooms, stiff joints, and the fear that our best days are behind us. But maybe, just maybe, God is not finished yet. Maybe the miracle is not becoming who we once were, but discovering that who we are now still matters. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder. You are not useless. You are not forgotten. You are simply walking a different chapter. May God bless you, protect you, and walk beside you through every season of life. May He bring comfort to the lonely, strength to the weary, and quiet hope to those who feel unseen. If this message spoke to you, please share it with someone who might need it today. Leave a comment. Your words may be the encouragement someone else is praying for. And subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, healing, and the quiet miracles that still happen every day. Until next time, may God's peace be with you.